Welcome back to the Simpleton Podcast, the most popular podcast in eternity. I return this week with my wife,
Hello.
Audrey.
Hello.
And something that's going to make us extra nervous today is not you, the listening audience here on YouTube, but we've got Pope Benedict listening to our podcast. We're reviewing his book, The Introduction to Christianity. Should probably be more embarrassing that God listens to the podcast. That's probably what really should be making us nervous here, but somehow we like to forget about God watching us all the time.
Not short on confidence, though. That's good.
Good. Yes. All right. We're going to start with a basic question. Let me lay out a little bit of a framework for today. So we've got this book, Introduction to Christianity. We need to introduce the idea of the book, Pope Benedict, and we're going to go through the preface. The preface of this book is more important than the preface of a normal book, and we'll get into that. As we approach the book, the first question is, why are we doing a multi-part series on Pope Benedict, or this book in general? Why do you even like Pope Benedict, Audrey?
Okay. I think we were both struck by the Father Fessio interview that you might have already mentioned, where he says, not only do I think he's a saint, I think he'll be considered a doctor of the church. And I believe he also said, as big a figure as St. Gregory the Great. And when he said that, it really just seemed totally true. But it's a motivation to just tap into the genius of Pope Benedict. Because I think when he was Pope, he was just attacked all the time in the media. And so even though he was like this brilliant voice, he was kind of blocked. And so I think it's important to help people reintroduce themselves to Pope Benedict. And I think he has an enormous amount of writings. This is one of his bread and butter, this is one of his books that he put just a ton of work into. Hearing him called a potential saint and doctor of the church, I think made us both excited to try to help people tap into what seems to be mostly untapped.
I agree with that. I came across him kind of early on when I was not Catholic for that long, in the late 90s. And I think priests who I knew were I think the Pope JP2 probably meets with this guy every day, to discuss what's going on, And he also was the guide behind the catechism. And I kind of knew those two facts. So I thought in my reading plan, I will look for some Ratzinger. His name before Pope Benedict was Joseph Ratzinger. And when I went to his bibliography, I immediately was struck by the title Introduction to Christianity. I thought, well, clearly that's where you start, And I picked it up and I had read enough theology up to that point. And Pope Benedict he's both the most profound theological writer I've probably ever read and one of the simplest. So it is approachable, but it's work, But when I picked it up, I was like, oh my gosh, this is not, I was hoping for a freshman level course in Christianity. And I'm this is what, advanced graduate school Christianity? I was just kind of what is with this title, You want to help us out with that? Because Audrey actually came up with the etymology of the title, which kind of makes your understanding of the whole thing change.
Sure. I think when we think of introduction, a lot of times we think of a general survey or something to kind of entice someone to learn more. And he has this brilliant mind and also is very observant of everything going on throughout his life. And he's, I think using the word introduction, the Latin root ducere is to lead into. So I think he's taken it very seriously to help lead people into Christianity. So the structure that we'll get into in future episodes is the creed. But I think he takes at least 90 pages or something like that just to get the phrase, I believe. What does it mean to say, I believe? So I think he's leading into Christianity, and he knows that he's speaking to people that have gone so far away from Christianity that they don't even know what faith even really is. He's speaking very much to modern man, and it's not a general survey of ideas. It's an attempt to actually lead people into Christianity.
I think of it kind of if Christianity is a highway ever moving, which I think is the way the Pope looks at it. He doesn't look at it as yes, these truths are eternal, but nothing's really static, nothing's frozen in the church. And you need on-ramps. You need places where you put your canoe into the river. You can't just like jump in, off the cliff or what, right? And at Simple House, we talk about this because we'll have missionaries who you start to struggle with these ideas like, do we introduce people to Catholicism by dragging them to adoration? Is that the right moment? Is the rosary the right way to introduce? Or are these, in fact, not good on-ramps? Maybe the right on-ramp is to go after the basic meaning of life. Or do you have a purpose in your life at all? Or does God particularly care about you? Like maybe these are the on-ramps we need. And I think with Benedict, this is not a question of just how do we help someone get some philosophy and get some Catholicism in their life. It's actually a question of they need an off-ramp off the worldview they're in and an on-ramp onto Christianity. And the worldview they're in is different. It's different in 1968. It's different in, the mid-90s. It's different today, right? So the stream of the world's also moving, and we got to get people seeing it as good news to off-ramp from that on-ramp to Christianity.
It makes me think of, like, in Aquinas, a lot of people love how thorough he is in his Summa, and he's usually making it clear that he understands the opposing side. This is more of the, like, argumentative form of getting to the truth, but he makes it clear that he always understands thoroughly what someone else is saying, and then he gives his reasons. Pope Benedict writes with a different structure. It's not written in that like almost formulaic way, but at the same time, he's kind of showing the audience that he understands the cultural forces, like we'll get into, of like modern man and all the forces that are leading to atheism, Marxism, leading people away from understanding what faith even is. He's being very thorough, and all of his words are very like, it's a slow read because everything he says matters, but he's speaking without it being the same style as the Summa. He's being very cohesive because he does care so much to actually to show people the beauty of Christianity and the truth of it.
When I had finished reading this book, Pope Benedict was not Pope yet, and I thought this is the best, most profound book I've ever read. And then when Pope Benedict became Pope, when Ratzinger became Benedict, I was like, well, great. Like, obviously, like, this is kind of like showing me that the Catholic Church is a sensible organization, I mean, I wasn't being that petty about it, but I was oh, this fulfills, like, the guy who I thought was the most profound is now Pope. Wow. And by this point, I'd already plagiarized his work extensively into the Simple House Missioner's Manual. Some of the better insights in there are just taken from this introduction to Christianity.
I think as a teenager, I grew up in New York. I was raised in a very rich Catholic home, not in the sense of like money rich, but in like a very intelligently Catholic household. But we were surrounded by so much atheism or just also kind of like apathy and the feeling of the church having been emptied out. Like there's a lot of beautiful churches that were built in previous generations that feel very empty. And so I remember as a teenager just kind of feeling like, why doesn't God sort of have a louder voice? Like, why doesn't God speak more loudly to his people? And as I've gotten older, I feel like the problem is more that we don't listen because we have so many enormous figures in the church. And even though they're giving the church what we need, we sort of don't tap it. So the other big example prior to Pope Benedict is John Paul II's Theology of the Body. I had like a brilliant group of women in my university tap into that work, and I would not have really accessed it on my own. I had been Catholic my whole life, and like I said, my parents are very intelligent and everything, but I think except for that one women's group, I would not have like received all of that, even though John Paul II had been like teaching it at every Wednesday audience for years. And so then we jump forward to Pope Benedict, and he's given us like this enormously rich text and many other rich texts, and still even like highly educated Catholics generally like haven't read it, So I think that our motivation in however many episodes this ends up being is to just introduce people to Pope Benedict. Like we want to encourage you to go read it, and we want to pull some of the gems out of it for you to be able to like think about, and so that when you do read it, maybe it'll be a little bit more of a smoother read. Hopefully we don't like distort any of the things that he says, but just to kind of help more people tap into this brilliant text.
And we're not going to be able to simplify it or go point by point because there are so many points. I sometimes judge books by how many like great ideas you get from them. And like, it's not unusual to have a book where you get one good idea, but it took you 100 pages. And sometimes you already had the idea by page 30 and the last 70 pages were a little bit of disappointment. Benedict is kind of like, you get that you get an idea about every page, which is a little bit like overwhelming, and we're not going to be able to cover every page, but we're going to try to do our best to get you. But it's still worth reading, even if you understood everything we said, enjoyed everything we said. You should still go read it because there's even more, right? One of the other interesting things is when Pope Benedict became Pope, when Ratzinger became Benedict, there was a question just kind of floating around about, do we change how do we treat his previous writings before he's Pope, right? And JP2 had a similar question in that he did a lot on theology of the body, which is now very accepted, right? But he never really took that theology of body and elevated it to the highest level of teaching that he could. He never put an encyclical, And by the way, Pope Benedict did. Like Pope Benedict's first encyclical is called God is Love. And the first third of it takes some of the most basic ideas from theology of the body, just real basic, nothing advanced, just puts it in the encyclical and kind of just elevates it as like, this is all just true, And then it goes somewhere else, which is a much more social doctrine area for God is Love. But it was just clear we just need to get this out there at the highest level, Well, with Pope Benedict on these writings, I don't think you should consider these, direct teachings from the Pope. It is the work of one of the greatest theologians of our time. And then once he is a doctor of the church, then he'll have that authority behind it too. Right now, it's just one of the works of the greatest theologians that lived in the last 100 years, maybe the last millennia, but we'll go there. With the idea that this is an on-ramp, the preface of this book has a different weight than a normal book, right? Like if we have a normal preface, it's like so-and-so was a nice woman and she wrote this in the later years of her life when this was happening to her. And you're never going to need to update that preface. That's a perfectly fine preface. Maybe you'll put 1 million copies sold. It's such a great hit, but the preface is more or less a static idea. With this book, he actually rewrote the preface. And I had one of the older versions. I had this orange and purple version from Ignatius Press back before they paid cover art people. And it has a short preface from the original 1968 edition. And then Audrey's version from Ignatius Press, where they do have a much more better looking version. I'm still partial to the orange and purple. Has a preface written in is it 99 or 98?
98, yeah.
98, 30 years after it was initially published. And this is quite important because as an on-ramp, the world had changed a lot in the last 30 years, and we need a different kind of understanding of where the world's at and what they're trying to get into with this book. So let's start with the original preface. The original preface, I'll summarize, then Audrey can try to interpret it. In my version, the parable that the preface begins with is Lucky Jack. What's your version, Audrey?
Clever Hans.
Then there's a typo in Audrey's version where they accidentally call Hans Jack.
At the bottom of the page, yep.
Ignatius Press, wake up. All right. So Lucky Jack, he has a very heavy stone. It happens to be gold. He doesn't really understand the value of the gold, and he keeps making trades. So he trades his gold for a goose. And then somebody's like, you don't really want a goose, you want a goose egg. So he trades it for an egg, and he keeps trading, in a sense, downgrading the stone at every level. But to his mind, it's getting better and better because it's less to carry. It's better than just having a rock. He thinks he's doing successful trades. Well, I'm pretty sure the other side of the trade knows they're getting the better end of the deal, right? And he ends up with a little stone that he might as well just throw away, right? He starts that as the parable to begin the book.
Yep.
How would you interpret that?
Well, I think it's actually a more powerful way of describing what people usually call watering down the faith. And so Clever Hans starts out with gold, but it's troublesome and heavy. He keeps trading it for other things. And then eventually whatever he's carrying, he's like, oh, I'll just throw this into the river and now have the freedom, use the word the freedom of carrying nothing. The character doesn't understand the value of what he has. And then he seems to think there's more value in carrying nothing. It just makes me think of kind of the inheritance of the church. And a lot of people treat tradition as now we've gone forward another couple decades, but at this time, especially in the 90s, this feeling of tradition as being some kind of weight, whereas again with the etymology, tradition to kind of hand on, and the purpose of that handing on is that you can also have that valuable thing for your life as you continue to move forward. Anyway, just kind of wanting to tap back into the richness of tradition, of what we've inherited, of what we carry as Catholics, and not making these like small compromises where we dwindle the value of what we have.
And I think it's changed a lot since 68. Like now I feel like there's a lot of people outside our church who believe that there is gold in the church, believe that somehow there's an important answer and perspective there. And even like you'll hear like someone kind of come at the church from a pretty secular paradigm. They're like, why has this existed for 2,000 years? Why has the Bible been passed down for, I don't know, 10,000 years, however long? Like, why are these stories considered so important that people hand wrote them and have died for them? You know, but then they have a problem like unlocking it. You know, Jordan Peterson comes to mind, where he looks at all these Old Testament stories from a psychologist point of view and is unlocking like an interesting psychological take. You know, I mean, I find it kind of interesting, but he's not kind of getting the meaning of life out of them, or the purpose or the relationship with God fully out of them, the personal loving relationship, you know? And so now I feel like they're, instead of thinking that all this stuff in the church, we don't know that it's a gold ingot. Now it's almost like a question of how do we like refine it? How do you tap in? How do you make it yours? You know? But I think we've all kind of, when you look back at the past, you see how we cheapen things. I've also seen in my young missionaries that we've all been to a homily where it says some crazy statement that's like literally straight from the lips of Jesus. Like, it's harder for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to pass through an eye of a needle. Or you call a man fool and you will just go to hell. And we don't want to talk about these things, or we talk about them in a way that like waters them down to where by the end you're like, actually the goal is to be rich. You know, it's the opposite of what Jesus said, he was trying to say. And the Simple House video this year was keep Christ dangerous. Like, don't let yourself water all this stuff down. Keep it radical, you know? And that has been like really hitting with the youth lately. That's what they want. You know, like, why even bother with this whole enterprise unless it is straight up gold, you know?
Can I say too, I think in the story of Clever Hans, the reason why he keeps on trading is so that it can be lighter and more comfortable. So it reminds me of the Pope Benedict quote from somewhere else that he says, you were not made for comfort, you were made for greatness. I think what we're seeing now in the church, young people kind of really desiring that, is like they were saturated. People who grow up in this extreme comfort, they like desire the greater meaning, like the feeling of like malaise, or what's that funny word?
Malaise, yeah.
Malaise, but there was a really funny word, affluenza. Yeah, the feeling of affluenza where your whole life has been comfortable and then you kind of have no meaning. I think is kind of bringing people back to try to tap into the richness of the Catholic Church. But what I love about Pope Benedict is he also makes it clear that the solution to this is not to become obsessed with the past. Our life of faith is not becoming fixated on the past. I think that's like really important. So this is from the 1968 preface. This is where the present book comes in. Its aim is to help understand the faith afresh as something that makes possible true humanity in the world of today, to expound faith without changing it into the small coin of empty talk, painfully laboring to hide a complete spiritual vacuum.
I don't know if this is a great sequitur, but like I hear a lot of people talk about the importance of churches for social community and for feeling nice about it and encouraging morality. And it's like, what the heck? I mean, like, it's either you were made by an all-loving God who deeply wants to know you, or you're not. And it's a pretty stupid joke if it's not, you know?
Right.
So let's not like, it's just like, I'm glad they appreciate the church has some good function in history, but that's just like not the on-ramp, you know? So after this preface, 30 years later, he writes a new one and it's re-released. And the new one, he characterizes this new moment in history, this new, Pope Benedict, who I learned the word Weltanschauung from, worldview, nice German compound word. So the worldview of the world has shifted, and he actually thinks it's shifted twice since his book. His book is published in 1968, and he believes the worldview actually shifted in 1968. So if you're published in 1968, you're probably written in 67 or earlier. And in 68, is that sexual revolution that we as Americans associate with Woodstock and drugs and free love and all that stuff. But Europeans have a different understanding of that. And I want to talk about that. And then the next major world like cataclysmic event that shifted the worldview was 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Also, as Americans, I think we take this differently than Europeans. This helped me kind of realize that we were viewing it differently than the Europeans were. Benedict talks about, so what was this 1968 event? Before you read this, what did you think it was?
Well, so I also made a note that that's when there was the assassination of Martin Luther King and Kennedy, and sexual revolution. Woodstock happened in 69. So there's like this upheaval of the 60s. And I remember my dad mentioning that there had been riots in Paris, but at the time it was like there was riots, but I couldn't tell what they wanted. And so we've kind of talked about when there's these, I love Pope Benedict kind of filling that in more, but when there's a sense of being dissatisfied by everything and kind of a tear down, but there's not actually any kind of cohesive plan of building, of making things better.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I want to keep with this idea of before I paid attention what I think it was, right? And then even now I'm not positive what it was. But we knew there was a sexual revolution, and there was this like escape from this like repression, it seems like, right? And it's kind of like, was it good? Was it bad? I mean, you're often told how great it was. Like the 60s are kind of glorified in American history as like a great time, you know, of peaceful protesting, love, not war type stuff, you know. But then you also know that somehow the American family took a big step back right then. You also see these, like, hate to say it, like one of them, my dad would say a few things that kind of made me wonder if it was like quite a bad thing. I've also read in just other little histories of companies and things, like what happened to the company during that period. And it was more or less a bad thing, like marijuana being smoked at work and all this stuff was happening in the American culture. But also that Forrest Gump movie always struck me because it kind of showed that there was a nasty side to the 60s, even behind this like facade of peace and love, you know? And I thought the Forrest Gump movie was a little bit brave for even just hinting that that might be true.
Yeah. Also, I think a lot of times in the Hollywood, in the industry of movies, they really try to portray the 50s as having all been terrible.
Right.
Like it's like all housewives were actually on drugs. Like they love to kind of portray the things that were sort of shattered after the 60s as if it was all oppressive. And so what he's describing is that in the post-war era, that young people were very dissatisfied with the Reconstruction efforts. And so they wanted to kind of shrug off all the institutionalization, like in general, like it became this great shrugging off, not only of the particular governments they were in, but of the institution of the church also. There was kind of an anti-institutional.
Yeah. When you go to Europe and you look at the 60s, the first thing that came up for me, like just kind of Googling around, was May 68. And it was a long article about the significance of the thing that made me Google was Ratzinger mentioned the barricades in Paris. And I go, why were there barricades? Like that sounds like French Revolution stuff, not 1968, you know? And when you look at it and you look at the photos of the barricades in Paris and the violence that was happening in Paris in the late 60s, you're seeing Stalin, Mao, Lenin, Marx flags, you know, you're seeing people who are very upset. And you got to think that Europe just had a totally different experience up to that point than the US. They had actually been growing really well. They'd had economic prosperity, but they were also coming from the point of being bombed out. You know, like they'd literally had armies coming through and killing people like 20 years before, you know, and the last time we experienced that's probably the Civil War, you know. So they were only 20 years away from, you know, World War II, where people are just living in bomb shelters and everyone lost family members, to having a good rebuilding period, good in the sense of just economically. I have no other sense of the word good for that. And then saying this sucks somehow. Like this is like we're rebelling, but it's not clear what they're asking for. I think that's what your dad was saying. They're like, what was the positive idea? Or was it just a rejection?
Right. Well, he just said there was a lot of young people rioting and I couldn't tell what they wanted. And I remember when the Black Lives Matter riots were happening here, where you were like, there's no positive vision. It's just kind of a teardown. In
fact, I think this is important, though, but I think we should go into it a little bit more. Like a long time ago, 20 years ago, the main violent protests we saw were World Bank protests. to the point, like I had a job within the world, like 2 blocks away from the World Bank, and I couldn't go to work because of riot police, sandbags, and protesters, right? And buildings being smashed, stuff like this, right? Then we had the Occupy Wall Street movement, and then we had like Black Lives Matter and something we all remember very recently. And in all 3 of those, the problem was being identified and the solution was not. And particularly with Black Lives Matter, I think a lot of Americans really wanted the solution and were really upset that nothing was offered. Like there was just the moment where they could have raised any money, asked for anything to retrain police, to reform things. And it just didn't happen. Like nothing, like no reasonable change, even experimentally on a small scale, seemed like it happened. Right. And it became to the point, like I would like interact with people online and I would say, well, let's talk about some positive things we could do, right? And you'd get shut down because it was very deliberate. You didn't want to do a positive vision. I don't know why. I don't understand why a revolution has that. Doesn't present a positive vision, but that seems to also have been the issue in 1968.
Well, I think it might be because they're usually fueled by anger, which is sort of not a productive force. So it's like a tear down force. But anyway, in terms of the preface, he's saying the 60s was this time of upheaval, not only shrugging off the post-war rebuilding efforts as inadequate, but actually wanting to shrug off the whole history of Christianity as inadequate. And then this huge attraction to Marxism as the new solution for man.
And he also mentions the church being viewed as merely kind of a Western colonial power that was used to like indoctrinate people into what they thought was evil, you know? So then fast forward to 1989. So in that era, when you have all this hostility towards the church with the youth, particularly the youth who was rebelling in 68, what's the on-ramp for them into Catholicism, right? But then in 1989, we have an enormous give up on communism. Like we have just all these communist countries just kind of like let down their guard. The Berlin Wall comes down. The Soviet Union gives up the communist project. And at this moment, it's not clear why communism and Marxism didn't just take the L. You know, it's just like say, like we no longer struggle with the idea of God kings. You know, like that idea has been retired. You know, it's not coming back and haunting us repeatedly. But like I feel like Marxism in 1989 had a pretty clear big L. You know, I mean, China was opening up. They'd realized they had that communism hadn't worked for them. They, in fact, killed the most people. And one of the things Pope Benedict points out is not only did communism not take the L or Marxism not take the L, they kind of were silent on, he said, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot, right? And it sounded like my dad. I mean, it was like, it's like, why do we not talk about this? Like, why do we not talk about the people who killed as many people as Hitler or killed way more? Mao, the air term of the number of people Mao killed, and he killed a lot through starvation, by the way, but the air term is bigger than the maximum estimate of the Holocaust deaths. You know, that means plus or minus a Holocaust is how many people Mao killed, you know? So it's just like, it's kind of inconceivable, yet not part of our education.
So I think he's saying that Marxism, that there was this surprising collapse of the Berlin Wall. You know, the 1989, he calls it a surprising collapse, but that people didn't actually want to fully give up on the ideology of Marxism. So I think there's this idea that, if we just try again, it might work next time. You know, so there's like this embarrassment or like purposely sort of blocking learning all the horrors that were caused by these totalitarian regimes in all different parts of the world, because they're not fully willing to give up on the ideology kind of still had too much of a hold. And this is just my own going off on it. I think that part of that also has to do with the sexual revolution, because feminism is kind of in some ways a subset of Marxism. But for a lot of people, it's more the pervasive thing that they're taking part in. They might not identify themselves as a Marxist, but they might essentially carry an ideology which is basically Marxist through feminism. So I think that's one of the reasons why they wouldn't give it up.
Sometimes when we like spread Marxism to include critical race theory, feminism, I do see the clear connection now. To me, the clear connection is the struggle between groups. You know, like if you're talking about patriarchy all the time and the power structures, you're using a Marxist perspective on history. And same with the race perspective when you do that, So I think it's very fair to call those things Marxist, But there's also like literal Marxism, where it's like we're still just talking about class struggle. And Benedict talked about liberation theology. What he actually said was Marxism remained the primary ethical guide of the West. Not Christianity, but Marxism. And that's just so weird when you take such a big L. Like when all those nations gave up on communism in 1989, it's just weird that it remained of such authority, And go ahead.
So he says Christianity failed at that historical moment to make itself heard as an epic-making alternative. So I think that's a big goal of the book, is to kind of reintroduce Christianity as the epic-making alternative to Marxism. And then he kind of describes that this was a big intention of Vatican II. That Vatican II was intended to endow Christianity with the power to shape history. And he brings it up that one of the reasons why Vatican II was called was because of how much the 19th century had subjected the life of faith to the private realm. And by being forced, which is really how it was in New York, by being forced into the completely subjective realm, it loses its ability to have like determinative action.
Like God is your opinion. It's not something you should have in the public square.
It blocks you from acting as a group. It really damages the body of Christ when you're so like, I did know people of different faiths in high school, but I had no clue what faiths they had because it was just so completely blocked from any interaction and any conversation. So he describes the 19th century forcing religion into the private sphere is why Vatican II was necessary, and that the intention and that what was supposed to be fermenting in those years of post-Vatican II is having Christians respond to the fact that their faith affects all of life, all of history,
Yeah, the idea that Vatican II is actually the thing, like I feel like that's not understood. Like we think of pre-Vatican II as like super strong faith where it mattered and everything. And what he's saying is actually the opposite. Pre-Vatican II, we were kind of getting in an era of faith as a private matter and subjective. And Vatican II was what was supposed to bring it back to public. That's something that I wouldn't have come off with right off.
Yeah, that's another line I remember from my dad. He's like, if Vatican II hadn't happened, the church would be a fossil. And I think a lot of people, that's also why I love Benedict, because he's so intelligent, but he repetitively makes this point about not becoming obsessed with the past. So Christianity is always good news. It's always breaking news. It's always entering our life right now. And so we don't kind of get back to a better culture by just behaving as if we're in a different culture, like we're supposed to kind of be the mouthpiece for the church and spreading the church like where we are right now.
Even the way we presented this idea, talking about the sexual revolution, talking about the fall of communism, we're almost already over politicizing it. And what happened after the fall of communism, according to Benedict, is that this liberation theology happens where we're trying to baptize Marxism. We're trying to essentially make Christianity a very practical thing that will run your government or reform things or make the world better. And it's just can't be treated at the practical level.
Right? So I think that's one of the most important points in the preface is you cannot baptize Marxism, and that the desire to become more active as Catholics he calls it a lightning bolt that struck fires in Latin America. And he describes liberation theology as he doesn't exactly, I don't think, say liberation theology is an attempt to baptize Marxism. Or maybe I'm just not fully following, but he does make it clear you cannot baptize Marxism, but a lot of people thought you could in the same way that Aquinas did with Aristotle. But what I would try to elaborate on is with Aristotle, he's a natural philosopher. So he's studying the truth based on creation. So he's like receiving creation and developing a philosophy based on what is real. So then Aquinas can kind of show how that's consistent with Catholicism. Marxism, he says, is not a philosophy, it's a praxis. So its focus is not on the truth, but on what we create. Yeah, anyway, so I think that's one of his most important points.
I think my understanding of this would be like, you cannot make your religion just a praxis, just a practical idea. Like you can't make friendship a practical concern, it can't, or any relationship. It can't be like, I do this once a month and that makes friendship or marriage or whatever the relationship is, right? There has to be like this this deeper thing that's not this like recipe type thing, right? Because what's interesting is after he says that they tried to make religion just praxis, just like a practical thing that would shape the world, he then says, of course, religion did practically shape the world, because like it's only when you have the friendship that you're not treating as just a praxis, it will change things. And it's really not friendship between humans. It's actually friendship with God, So like when you have this interpersonal relationship with the Lord, it will change everything. It'll create human rights. It'll create, justice for workers. It'll do all these things. But if we kind of skip that step and try to go straight to just the practical application of justice for workers, somehow I think we miss everything and we actually mess it up.
Marxism, it says one does not presuppose truth, but rather creates it. I think that's a really big deal. So Marxism is focused on man's action within man's sphere. And then he kind of later states one of the main problems with this is that it leaves God out completely. God has nothing to do. And we're supposed to have this huge drive to perfect our own world.
Well, what I'm thinking when you say that is how I've noticed this idea that something is true if it pushes us towards our goal, which is false, And so they'll like be okay with like propaganda as long as it's like pushing us towards the goal that we have, and anything not pushing us towards that goal is not true.
They're okay with violence.
Okay with violence, but they're also just doing violence to the truth right there too, right? They're not giving, you actually have to give the devil his due. Yeah. Like to the extent he's done anything right, you should say so. But I'm seeing that in politics a lot now and everything, that it's not about reporting what happened. It's about pushing the story towards where you want it to go, which is just, I think what you're saying, it doesn't presuppose there is a truth. It creates truth.
So a big correction to this is like what Father Adam used to say, obedience to reality. So, and in Theology of the Body, talk a lot about receptivity to the truth. Part of the feminine genius, part of how the feminine genius needs to help shape the culture is that we are receptive beings. So a big error in modern man is this obsession with our own creative power and our own activity. Whereas really, we're not supposed to be completely passive, but we're not supposed to be completely active. We're supposed to be co-creators with God. And so we are in error whenever we fall into either side. So like feminism, for example, places this huge primacy on the work that a woman does that she just chooses to do. So like I was talking to somebody recently, they really love the idea of like women astronauts and really hate, taking care of toddlers or whatever. But it's like there's this huge value on whatever the current culture thinks is valuable to be considered, smart, whatever, and really kind of rejects receiving the work that God gives you to do and rejects the value of that receptivity.
I think as Catholics who are very doctrinaire, you can fall into another error with that, where you're like inflicting your truth that you've kind of got your theology onto reality. Reality is from God too. It's a way for us to learn about him. So we have to honor the truth that's actually just before us, and be obedient to it. I think there's an interesting idea here that like Benedict is building bridges between Catholicism and the errors of the day, or the thought of the day, or the mainstream of the day. And I think usually when we think of building bridges, that concept's been compromised to think that you're building bridges to tie two things together so that they're more aligned, right? He's building bridges so people cross over, right? And that they will never be aligned, because one of them is the radical truth of God that will reinvent your whole life, and the other one is the stupid mainstream malaise, So we need to be building these bridges, right? We need to be deeply understanding the malaise in order to give it its due, show its shortcoming, and invite in, not in order to show that we're aligned with the malaise, right? And I feel like that's what this work is doing.
Well, I wanted to add a couple things. So he kind of gets to the attempt to baptize Marxism, create that. This was kind of energizing to a lot of people, especially I guess in Latin America. But there was this way of treating Christ. Christ becomes not the Christ. He becomes like a revolutionary man, or a man who experienced God in a special way. And And then this other major error of like that God the Father is completely out of the equation because man perfects his own sphere. Maybe God created the universe and set it all into motion like a watchmaker does, a fancy watch or something, but he's not actually entering into the sphere of man's life. So he kind of identifies needing to reintroduce Christianity as a Christocentric faith, as a biblical faith, as a response to God the Father, and not what we might have like absorbed sort of culturally about Christ just being kind of a revolutionary figure. And I know Bishop Barron kind of starts at this point a lot. It's like Jesus is not just another nice teacher. Like he either is who he says he is, or he's a madman. Like Christ loses his inner logic when we try to kind of make him into this other type of historical figure. But then I think one of the other best, aside from you can't baptize Marxism, I think the second most profound point that I found in this preface was that when man is reduced to being an economic and political creature, he also completely loses track of the dignity of man. So he says, what on earth is man supposed to think of man? And we can no longer find anything of the divine mystery in the other. So then he kind of describes like human trafficking and all this stuff that we have going on now is sort of the fallout of man thinking that he can perfect his own sphere, or is only concerned with his own sphere, and like ignoring God, is that we really don't have a sense of the dignity of like kind of like the holy fire that each person has been given by being a creature of God.
Right. So I had not made that connection very well, but the idea is that like when religion is no longer these eternal special principles, but is like a praxis, you lose this idea that people are very eternal special things. And the other example, he actually literally said the human trafficking example of Albanian women ending up in the rest of Europe as prostitutes, being tricked into this, right? And then he also mentioned stem cells and like growing fetuses for organs and things like this, right? That like when Christianity is only a practical political movement that's supposed to shape a healthy society, it loses that divine like right to life. That you're so special, that all these things, right? And he also mentions in there, as this preface goes on, this idea that people have kind of taken for granted that people know what morality is, and they're kind of taking that for granted because we do live in a historically Christian culture, and this Nietzsche idea of you're breaking with Christianity, but you're pretending that the morality will continue. That all of us will just know what it means to be a good person, right? And the Nietzsche idea, I think we've called the cut flower hypothesis. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that as you like destroy the foundation of Christianity, but pretend we can still operate with all the moral assumptions, it doesn't last very long. The flower dies after you cut it, And so he's basically making that exact point in the preface.
Then he also, I think, gives us, especially having been a teenager in the 90s, he gives this brilliant description of how people still desired religion, but it became kind of a search for like a mysticism, and they didn't want dogma, they didn't want institutionalization. And I remember that very much from the 90s. People would have like dream catchers on their wall, or like Buddhas in their room and yin yang earrings and stuff, or they'd have like all three. And it didn't seem to matter that much if they had actually pursued it. There wasn't necessarily like a sincere pursuit of other religions, but there was a sense of like wanting to seem spiritual. Like there's kind of a desire, he's kind of showing that the destructive force of Marxism, but that also there's this impulse to like still desire the eternal, but a lot of times people were searching for it. He calls it like a peek through the curtain into the next world or something. He like that it started showing up in these other ways of viewing religion that were very non-institutionalized.
It's interesting that about a dozen years after he wrote, there was the new atheist phenomena where they kind of got frustrated because as they were defeating all the Christian arguments, they thought everyone was just choosing new religions, and not Christianity, but just like secular religions or whatever. And they came to the conclusion that maybe we shouldn't defeat Christianity because it appears that man needs religion, and they'll get something a lot worse than Christianity if we keep attacking Christianity. It's interesting because it's like there was this period in the 90s, you'd see it even down to today, where There's a desire for spiritual dabbling. Well, you just can't get rid of the spirit world. I mean, every culture, every civilization has come to think that's important. They all have their own take. But if you try to like reject Christianity out of the culture, there will be people spiritually searching. And they might come up with a lot cheaper things like dream catchers rather than rosaries or something, or things rather that what it's always reminded me of is like someone who wanted to be a martial artist who always goes to the free opening classes at every dojo. So they've got a white belt in all of them, but they haven't gotten proficient in any of them.
Yeah, I think the idea of like spiritual but not religious was treated as like very enlightened or kind of like a pseudo pluralism. I
feel like people are now like just the zeitgeist of today is people are seeing through that, you know?
Yeah. So it's interesting though. But having been a teenager in the 90s, I'm like, he's very accurate. He's a very accurate observer of the historical forces.
All right. So we covered a tremendous amount of ground and I don't think we got to the end of the preface.
Yeah, I normally skip introductions. Like I'm normally of the mindset that you don't read the introduction to a book, you just read the book. But with this book, the introduction is pretty profound.
Yeah, we got a Lucky Jack or Clever Hans. We got 1968, we got 1989, and we got Dream Catchers. And we're not through the preface yet. The challenge is laid before you, Simpleton audience. Take up the challenge.